Chase Thomas podcast. My nephew needs me to record. See, I already hate it. I hate it.
All right, welcome back. Chase Thomas podcast, taping this on a Thursday afternoon. Connor O'Gara of SaturdayDownSouth.com is here. Connor, good afternoon, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well, man. It's crazy we only got 3 weeks of the regular season left. I feel like I always say fall goes at 1.5 speed, and this year has been no different.
No, it's wild. And I mean, the next couple weeks are going to be good. I mean, outside of next week, the SEC schedule, I don't know why they do this. I mean, I guess because they want to make sure the two premier programs in the conference get all the eyeballs in Tennessee and Georgia next week. You want to make sure that everyone in the conference is locked and loaded and what's going on inside Neyland Stadium next Saturday as Georgia tries to tie the SEC record here. So I understand why they make the rest of that weekend just a bunch of no-name G5 schools versus insert favorite team here. But, you know, as you know, Connor, a long-term ardent supporter of the Vols and everything that they've got building, you understand why you got to make them the premier watch next weekend, right?
I'll take it. You know what? I call it Cake Week. I think Cupcake Week has kind of a negative connotation to it, and people consider cupcakes to be very soft. I think the SEC needs a rebranding because everybody loves cake, and Cake Week is something that is a lot more positive, in my opinion. It can't be used against you from other conferences, from the anti-SEC crowd. And I think that there are a lot of benefits to cake that just aren't there with cupcakes, but that's me as a bearded guy just lashing out. So yeah, look, having Tennessee in that premier spotlight game, for the purists, I'm sure it upsets them. But at the same time, for those of us that just want to be entertained in a given weekend, I'll take it. And I'm looking forward to it, even if it doesn't have East implications in terms of who's winning the division.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. We don't know yet. We'll see on Saturday if it has East implications. My question to you first, is Tennessee going to win out? So they've got at Mizzou this Saturday. They get Georgia at home, and Tennessee has not lost a home game since 2021, and that was against Georgia, where I was in attendance. And then you also got Vanderbilt at home, which I think will be pretty doable on that front. So I ask you, Connor O'Gara, are they going to win out?
No.
Okay.
Nope. Don't think so. Look, I was all offseason last year, I was the biggest advocate that Tennessee was going to go into Athens and beat Georgia. And when Tennessee had the year that it had and is number one in the first playoff poll rankings, I was feeling pretty good about that. I was feeling pretty darn good, and double down, did the whole deal. And obviously, egg on my face, Georgia did what Georgia's been doing throughout this 3-year run, and it took the soul of a team that had life. And this year, I think that there is an expectation that Georgia, this team is just not as dominant. Now, because they are not as dominant, some might assume that they are much more vulnerable. I don't know that that's necessarily the case. And I think we see the little things that this team does, like in a win against Mizzou, which, look, 9-point win against Mizzou, a really solid Mizzou team that I'll say some nice things about in a bit, but it's not going to lead the championship DVD. It's just not. If Georgia wins a championship, we're not going to go back to Mizzou and be like, oh, that's really when we figured out how good this team was. But they do so many little things over the course of a game. And even something as simple as like Jamon Dumas-Johnson breaks his forearm in that game. And it's like, all right, so what's going to happen? You got to turn to a true freshman who comes into the game at middle linebacker, and he has the pressure that ultimately forces Brady Cook into that interception that he throws to Nazir Stackhouse and is the play of the game. And so, like, they do things like that. Oscar Delp showing that he is not just a backup tight end who has benefited from his surroundings. Some of the things that he's doing in place of Brock Bowers has been darn impressive. And Georgia fans are talking like Brock Bowers is going to come back next week. So be on the lookout for that. I mean, I've always joked Brock Bowers, I don't think he's actually a human being. This would kind of confirm that. So yeah, this Georgia team has been unbelievably impressive, despite the fact that they have not been as dominant.
I'm just more, as someone who watched Cedric Tillman come back from the same surgery a year ago on the outside, I think I see a lot of comparisons to what Tua's timeline was. And if he comes back Saturday, he'll be right at where Tua was a couple of years ago for Alabama. But I think the difference is, I mean, quarterback and tight end versus wide receiver, it's just different. It's a different kind of scenario. And Cedric Tillman was never the same all of last year after coming back from the tightrope surgery. He was effective a little bit in the Georgia game, but the explosion and just kind of being that go-to guy was not the case the rest of the way when he comes back. And I think if you're a Georgia fan, I understand it's Brock Bowers. He's a man among boys, but my if I was a Georgia fan, I would be very, I don't know, just very cautious with my expectations of what he'll ultimately be the rest of the way, because he also has to think about what's coming down the pike, the next level, things like that. My gut tells me he is not going. You're not going to see the version of Brock Bowers before the injury the rest of this season, would be my guess, especially in workload.
Yeah, I don't know that the volume is going to be quite the same. That's the thing about him that's just so unbelievable, is that how many tight ends have you watched take over football games? And
Yeah.
we've seen him do it on several occasions. Even the 2021 SEC championship, a game that Georgia lost, the only time they've lost in the last, 43 games. I actually thought Brock Bowers took over that game down the stretch if you go back and watch. And it was so unbelievable to watch a true freshman play as well as he did on that stage. But yeah, I'm kind of more on your side with that than the belief that he's going to come back and look like Brock Bowers. I will say, if there's anybody who's going to come back on a quick timeline from that surgery and do incredible things, it's Brock Bowers, who, for my money, is the best player in college football when he is healthy. And while I am admittedly skeptical about the really quick timeline, I just think that some of the things that he has done has already made us rethink what's possible of the tight end position in college football. Why not make us rethink what's possible of the human ankle?
Absolutely. You talked about Mizzou and Georgia and what we learned, and like that won't be ultimately like what got Georgia back to a three-peat status by taking care of Mizzou at home, but they did play with Georgia really well. And I'm curious, over the last 2 years, because they obviously had Georgia on the ropes at home last year in Columbia, and then they played them really well deep into the fourth quarter last week. And I'm curious, from your perspective and your vantage point, Connor, what does Mizzou do uniquely that frustrates this Georgia team over the last two times that other SEC teams have not been able to crack?
Their pressure packages are unique. What Blake Baker has done as the defensive coordinator of this Mizzou team the last 2 years, I think what he does to confuse that Georgia offensive line is something that other teams are going to try and copy, because Carson Beck wasn't hit like that all year. He was sacked 3 times in that game last week. And they were doing things with their front seven that I think kind of flustered that offensive line. And I've rarely come away from a game feeling like Georgia's offensive line didn't have that advantage. And that was a game in which I didn't really think they had that advantage. And Carson Beck is great when he's kept clean. When he is kept clean and throwing deep over the middle, he is so fun to watch. And the ability that he has to stretch the field with such poise has continued to improve. But if you knock him off of his schedule and you kind of get him to a place where he's rushing throws, that's where you're going to have success. And, last year they had 4 consecutive drives, Georgia did, where they got into the red zone and I think didn't come away with a touchdown. Like it was field goal every single time. So obviously 7 points, 3 points, you'd rather have the 3 points if you're a defense, and doing that, that's a very basic way to look at it. But that Mizzou defense deserves a lot of credit, because they were a huge reason why they were able to stay in that game, a game in which Luther Burden is banged up in the middle of it. And that's something that, I'm wondering about going into this Tennessee game. But that Mizzou defense is it's not going to be lights out, unbelievable, hold you to 3 points for an entire game, but they do things very well up front. They're very experienced up front.
And I wonder too, the biggest thing with Georgia that's different that you talked about with the sacks for Carson Beck is he's just not a mobile guy. Like, he's not going to create with his legs to the extent that Stetson Bennett was just so frustrating, especially in the Tennessee Georgia game last year. Was just that, like, he's a difference maker with his legs. He's far more comfortable. He has a lot more wiggle than Carson in that regard. And that's been something that Tennessee fans have been very frustrated with Joe up until the last few weeks, is that now you have these design runs. Now you have Joe searching for contact early in the first quarter to kind of get him in a groove. And I think that's been a huge difference maker for Joe in completing nearly 80% of his passes the last few weeks, is that he is in a really good rhythm and he is so much more comfortable running with the football. I wonder if that is something that we have to watch for this Georgia team, is you don't see a lot of these kind of prototype quarterbacks. Because, look at Michigan with J.J. McCarthy. He's still pretty movable. Max Duggan last year was very comfortable on the run. You look at just the majority of the Pac-12 quarterbacks who are really good this year. Bo Nix, obviously very comfortable with his legs. I just don't think you see many guys like Beck and Milton from the early part of the year have a lot of success. And even Jane Daniels and Jalen Milrow, part of the reason that game was so high scoring last weekend was because both guys were so good on the ground and just frustrate defenses so much, and they put so much pressure on them when they have that added element of being okay with running the football. And I wonder if that's something that ultimately inhibits Georgia down the stretch here. I don't know. I'm curious what you think.
It could. I think Carson Beck has some mobility that reminds me of Stetson. If you look at some of the, yeah, I do. And he doesn't have to run as much. He hasn't necessarily he's not necessarily as confident in that area. I think that's more so what it is. But if you look at the moves that he will make in the red zone and some of the times where he puts his foot in the dirt, you'll be like, oh, okay. All right. Didn't know that you had that in the bag. He doesn't do it as often, but he still does it more than the level of a Jake Fromm, who, my God, I don't know if there is, PFF probably has this stat or something like that, but if there is a stat for yards left on the field for RPOs that you should have kept, Jake Fromm is the all-time leader at that. Like the amount of holes that guy could have run through, and instead he's like, nah, you know what? I'm going to hand it off to Sony Michel. I'm going to hand it off to Nick Chubb. Don't blame him. I would do the same thing too. DeAndre Swift as well, no big deal. But like the amount of times where defenses did not consider it a true RPO and he could have had 12 yards easily, I think Beck is a little bit more willing to do that than a Fromm, but he's not quite as confident as Stetson Bennett, and he's not going to make the plays like some of the things that Stetson was doing against Oregon, and where he's just backing up against pressure and continuing to keep his eyes downfield. Like that's not necessarily in Carson Beck's bag just yet. But I still am really encouraged by the mobility within the pocket and his confidence to be able to keep his eyes downfield and not look down at his feet and assume that a sack is coming.
Let's say Tennessee does beat Georgia next week. They beat them. It's at home. It's in Neyland. It's going to be rocking. The East may or may not. I tend to agree with you that I don't think the East will be up for grabs next week, but I do also think Tennessee's beating Mizzou on Saturday. But I wonder, from your perspective, what is the path? What is the path to Tennessee dethroning this Georgia team at home in this kind of atmosphere with some of the limitations that Georgia has this year that they may not have had the last 2 years, because they are a little bit different, and part of what just destroyed Tennessee outside of the rain that a lot of people have had fun with last year in Athens was that there was no answer for Jalen Carter. Like they were sending doubles, but Hendon Hooker didn't have time. There was nothing you could really do with somebody like Jalen Carter or Jordan Davis in the middle the last 2 years. They don't really have that game changer on the defensive line, and Tennessee's offensive line is as healthy as they've been at any point this year. And I think they'll be okay. Like I think they've handled the strong fronts like Texas A&M, very good defensive front. They weren't able to really put a lot of pressure on Milton in that game. I think they'll ultimately have a lot more time than they had the last 2 years. I think obviously Heupel plays a lot better at home than he does on the road in the SEC. I think it will be, I mean, you look at the DraftKings line, it's at 7 for next week as of right now. I think depending on how this weekend goes, it's going to be a very close, lower scoring game than people might anticipate going into next week. But I don't think it's a slam dunk that it's like, oh, Georgia's just going to come back and do what they did the last 2 years, which was really put the clamps on Tennessee in the second half and kind of upend them, similar to what Bama did at home in the second half against Tennessee. But I don't know, do you share that sentiment, or do you think there is a path to Tennessee actually giving the Dogs their first loss?
I'm not quite there, but if there is a path, it starts this weekend. I think Georgia's stretch of having 3 potential top 15 opponents, depending on how the Tennessee-Mizzou result plays out this weekend, having 3 consecutive top 15 matchups is not easy, especially this time of year. Man, like I remember 2010 Alabama having that stretch, that 3-game stretch where by the end of it, the South Carolina Stephen Garcia game happens. And I'm not saying that that's going to happen to Georgia, but if Georgia is in a dogfight with Ole Miss, which I think is on the table, I really do. I think Ole Miss does a lot of things that Mizzou does. And I think that being able to stay in a 60-minute game with them is very much on the table, despite the fact that Georgia hasn't lost at home at night since 2009. I mean, this is obviously
kind of terrifying.
That is terrifying, man. Like that. If I'm an Ole Miss fan, I'm just like, oh, really? It's been 14 years. Yeah. Okay, sweet.
But also, if you're an Ole Miss fan right now, you're just like, this is all awesome. Like Lane's got you in uncharted waters right now. Like you're playing a top 10 game on the road at Georgia at night, like with all eyeballs on you. It's like At what point are you like, no, this is pretty great. This might be the pinnacle of what we can be in the SEC in 2023.
See, that's the rational perspective, and then there's
Yeah.
the other of, hey, we're now paying a head coach $9 million a year, and this we're very much seeing our ceiling this year. It's never going to get better than this. And there are some fans that see that reality and they're like, oh crap, that kind of sucks. But yeah, I think that the path starts this weekend for both teams. I think on the Georgia side, like playing a 60-minute game against Ole Miss and coming into Tennessee, where like, man, by the end of it, you could be questioning, does this Georgia team have its legs? A defensive line that doesn't have the depth that it's had the last 2 years. Could they be struggling to slow down this Tennessee ground game down the stretch, this versatile, dynamic Tennessee ground game? That I think is the path. And then also for Tennessee, I want to see these deep connections this week. I want to see those against those aggressive Mizzou corners. Abram Strain, who's going to be an NFL guy, is going to be one of the top corners taken in the 2024 draft, very likely. And I want to see, can Joe Milton establish that deep connection and not just do so against weaker competition and not do so because a cornerback falls down, like the long pass that he had in the Kentucky game, which,
Chaz
nice
did
play.
kind of juke him. That Chaz deserves a lot of credit for what he did on that
True.
route. I would say that was a lot of Chaz Nimrod and what he did to that corner.
True. That's perfectly fair. But I mean, like you know what I'm talking about? Like so many times with Hendon, it was like if a guy had a step, he just hit him.
Yeah.
And with this Tennessee offense, that just hasn't been the case this year. It's crazy to think that, what is it? Auburn, I think, is the only team with fewer 20-yard completions than Tennessee. I mean, that is just baffling for a Josh Heupel offense. So can you see that this weekend? Can you see that against Mizzou? Because if you do that against Mizzou, you have a lot better chance of doing it against Georgia. Doesn't mean that you're going to have that great of success, because I think Laster, what he's done on the outside at corner for Georgia, Tyke Smith is having a whale of a year now that he's finally healthy. And on the back end, Malachi Starks, man, is as good as it gets at the safety position. So it's not that it's an easy group to throw on by any means, but just being able to have that time, and maybe it's a gas defensive line for Georgia. That's the path for Tennessee. I think it starts this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is I think the matchup actually kind of favors Tennessee in a weird way, where this year Tennessee, like you alluded to, is just, they're not a downfield team. They're not taking shots. They had a couple broken plays. Like Joe had a great ball to Squirrel where he actually threw guys open on Saturday, and we haven't seen Joe throw guys open at all this year. And I was telling some buddies this week about, like, one of the jarring things about Nico versus Joe in the same game is that Nico is already, like, he's big Bryce Young. Like that, it's almost like this man has only been watching Bryce Young tape for the last 4 years, and he's just a 6'7" version of him. So and the biggest reason is he's so natural in the pocket where he's not looking to run, but his eyes are always downfield, and a play is never dead. Like, he is just moving around, and he has such a natural feel for the pocket and moving to be exactly where he needs to be. He's so comfortable off platform. Those are all things Joe cannot do. Joe tried to do that, and you can see when things go awry for Joe. Joe deserves credit for buying into the coaching and just being like, you are going to be the elite game manager. And that is what he's been, where it's so robotic. Like, those throws were just like, there's no, it's just, it's amazing to watch, where it's like, he's almost like a hypo cyborg now, where he is, you're allowed to do this, this, and this. And they tried to make it easy this year to start the year where they were doing side to side. Like, all the passes early on was side to side. And you have Brew McCoy, who's one of the best wide receiver blockers in college football. So it made sense why you're trying to do that, to break Squirrel and Dante Thornton open. Dante Thornton being a huge bust out of the portal from Oregon, I think, has been a big limitation as to why Tennessee is not taking a lot of those deep shots, because Squirrel's just more of an over-the-middle guy. Like, he's more of the screens. He's not the Jalen Hyatt in the slot that they've had the last couple of years. So
Which
I think there was going to be
and I was wrong about that. I definitely thought he was going to be like step in, because you look at the numbers last year, what he was doing down the stretch, you're like, God, they got another one. And I thought one of my bold predictions was that Squirrel White was going to lead the SEC in receiving. And I'm not going to hit on that one, but yeah, I agree with you. It hasn't necessarily been the receiving room that we thought Tennessee could have, in part because of the McCoy injury and then Thornton as well. Yeah,
they just don't have dudes. Like, that's part of it. It's just they don't have, like, they don't have second round NFL draft guys. They don't have third round NFL draft guys right now. Mike Matthews, 5 stars coming in. Like, they have talent in the pipeline, but it takes time to learn this offense. It takes time. Like, Jalen Hyatt wasn't a dude his first year in the Heupel system. Like, he was okay, but then he just popped out of nowhere last year, and it just all clicked. So I don't know. It might be Squirrel next year. It might be Dante Thornton on the outside, because he's moved back to the outside, which is where he seems to be a lot more comfortable than in the slot. Maybe he pops next year in a Javonte Payton type deal, where it's just only touchdowns, and then it's like, I'm going to get my cardio in for the rest of this game. But, I mean, to bring it all home, Jalen Wright averaging over 7 yards a carry. Dylan Sampson really emerging as just a completely different change of pace guy. Jabari Small being just steady Eddie as the third back. I think this is the type of team that you saw Mizzou. They gave Georgia problems. You saw teams that are going to give them issues is that teams that stop the run can get after the quarterback. Tennessee, James Pierce has been a huge breakout candidate for them. Tyler Barron's been awesome in his final year here. I think they're going to get pressure on Carson Beck. And I also think Tennessee's they've shown they can win games where they don't score 30 points anymore. They have shown now that Heupel is versatile, where he was all pass last year and now it's all run. The best thing about Georgia's defense this year is what you talked about. Lassiter, Tyke Smith, Malachi Starks. Tennessee is more than fine not challenging those guys deep. Tennessee is more than fine being like, look, if you're going to stay back and you're going to play physical on the outside and play physical on the perimeter and not let our guys get open, fine. But we're still going to run the ball down your throat, and we're going to bank on the beat up linebackers and just not as deep of a defensive line rotation and see if we can win that way at home. And I think that's actually a more advantageous situation for Tennessee than what we've seen the last 2 years. Which is weird.
Because you would never say, oh, you know what the plan of attack is against the Georgia defense? It's actually just run the ball right at them. Like,
yes.
What? That doesn't seem right.
I think that's what they're going to do, though.
I do too. I think it's the path. And obviously, you'd love to be able to hit on the occasional deep shot. To me, that's the backbreaker. That's what's going to push this over the top. And the old cliche, establish it. You get a safety to bite once, his eyes are in the backfield, over the top, boom. That is when Heupel is at his best, his absolute best with this team. And this Georgia defense that we saw have so many struggles in that Auburn game against a very one-dimensional Auburn offense that has set the forward pass back about 100 years. Now, they've had a better couple of weeks. Competition probably has something to do with that. But the takeaway from that game was, oh, my God, Georgia just had its worst day defending the run in 5 years. You can run on Georgia. That seems strange. Then the next week, Ray Davis really struggled to run against Georgia. It was a Georgia home game at night, as we just mentioned.
Yeah,
they are lights out at home at night. But I do think that is the path for Tennessee, is sticking to what it does best. You don't have to reinvent the wheel and try and stretch the field. And it's a very different approach than what they probably had last year, and an effective approach because of what they had in Jalen Carter up front, because they could have that extra help in the defensive backfield to be able to not get beat over the top by these Tennessee receivers, like we saw Alabama get beat by them, obviously, in that game in Knoxville. But I'm looking forward to it. I don't want to look past the game this weekend, though, that Tennessee has against Mizzou, because I feel like that's so on the back burner nationally because of the two top 10 matchups we have with Ole Miss and Georgia, and then obviously Michigan and Penn State. Michigan finally playing somebody. But I am looking forward to that one. I feel like there are going to be a lot of interesting takeaways on both sides for those teams.
I think it's gonna be close, but it's a big one, and I think Tennessee should be fine by and large. I'm not as worried about Mizzou as I was a few weeks ago. And I also think, what's great? Tennessee took advantage of playing Texas A&M right after A&M got their brains beat in by Alabama.
Good timing.
Yeah, this is really good timing to get them right after Georgia and the physical nature of what that was, and to just go right back and play another just highly physical team. This version of Tennessee is going to be tough for them to stop. I think Tennessee should be fine, but I do think it's going to be close late. It won't be like the first two where this Heupel team really blew out.
60 plus. Yeah,
I don't think it's going to be the case on Saturday, but we'll see. Final thing, Connor, rapid fire. Here's your picks, and then we get out of here. Tennessee, Mizzou. How do you think it goes?
I did a disclaimer on my pick. I never do this. Never do this. I said Mizzou, if Luther Burden plays, wins by 3. If Luther Burden doesn't play, Tennessee wins by 3.
Okay.
Is that fair?
That's fair. Okay. All right. I disagree, but that's fair. Ole Miss, Georgia.
Georgia, but it's close. Ole Miss covers. I could see a world in which Ole Miss has a chance to win it late with a final possession, and then it's like Jackson Dart taking a big time sack. Georgia gets off the field. It's like a 31-28 type game.
Interesting. I think this is Carson Beck's best game. I think Carson Beck actually unloads and exposes this Ole Miss defense is not as good as what people might think. I think it's like 45 Georgia, 24 Ole Miss. I don't think this is as close as Mizzou. I actually think Georgia's a big breakout week.
Do you know the lane stat that I dug up early in the offseason that's been making the rounds? Georgia fans got a hold of it, and they're like, oh, we're all in this weekend. Lane, in his career as a head coach, his entire career as a head coach, in games against Power 5 teams who have gone on to win 9 regular season games or more, He's 1-19 in those games in his career. Doesn't have a win against a Power 5 team who went on to win 9 regular season games since 2011 when he was at USC and they beat Oregon. And now if LSU goes 9-3 this year, obviously that's win number 2.
They got to win out though.
They got to win out, so it's not even a given that they're going to get there. But that's the one thing that I come back to with Lane all the time that I'm like, is he the best fit for Ole Miss? Obviously, no doubt about it. But in a big time game like this, I just can't quite get there.
No, especially on the road. Like it's different when you play at Georgia and Alabama. And Heupel will say nothing on the matter as what it's like playing in those two particular venues. Then final one, Tennessee, Georgia. So let's say with those picks, they go the way that you think they do. So if Tennessee loses to Mizzou and Georgia wins, how do you think Tennessee, Georgia goes? Do you think they lose back-to-back in this scenario?
Yeah, that's early. It's early for a pick on that one, man. It really is.
Are you really going to go 0 for 2 for the Vols over the next 2 weeks with how they're playing? Are you going to do it?
It'd be 0.5 and 1.5, I guess it would be. Yeah, I mean, I'm still picking Georgia to win. I'm still picking Georgia to win on the road. It's not personal.
Heartbreaking. It feels personal.
That's hey, if anything, that's good. Don't look at my picks against the spread this year. Lock of the week has been really good.
Okay,
but
just don't lock. Okay, you can lock us up, but no picks of the week or no, just normal. Yeah. Okay.
No, we're not gonna do lock of the week on that one. But look, I think Georgia has found so many unique ways to be able to win, and they are so comfortable for a team they're so comfortable late in games now for a team that is so dominant. And that's just not a given. And like you see the way that they come into halftime. And I don't know if you saw at halftime, the SEC Network tweeted this out, but when they were getting smoked by South Carolina in that first half, and it was like, what in the world is going on? And you see the way that Kirby approaches his team. You see the way that Glenn Schumann addresses that entire defense. You're just like, oh, okay, I get it. I get it. I get why this team doesn't flinch. And in a game like this, on the road, big time atmosphere, even with the East possibly locked up, very likely going to be locked up, I still think that they're going to have the right approach. And as much as I do love what Tennessee has embraced this year and how they have played into their strengths, I still think that Georgia and Carson Beck, they find a way. They just find a way to be able to win one of these games on the road.
Heartbreaking. A lot of big recruits for this one, too. It's going to be fired up. It's a humongous recruiting weekend for Tennessee as they try and close up this 2024 and 2025 class early on. But Connor, what can the good folks check out from you and the team over at SaturdayDownSouth.com and the podcast this week?
Yeah, appreciate that. My buddy Matt Hayes joined me. Episode dropped, depending on when you're listening to this. Yeah, dropped Thursday morning and got into a lot of different coaching candidate stuff, which I always love talking about with Matt because he's super, super plugged in, talks coordinator stuff, USC defensive coordinator openings, threw out a few names there that are really interesting. Florida potentially getting a play caller in there for Billy Napier, what that would look like, some potential candidates there. A lot of interesting things to discuss with Matt. And then obviously, previewing a very interesting week 11 in the SEC. We only get 2 of these weeks in the entire season, wherein it's full seven SEC games, no bye weeks, no non-conference games. I love that. There are a lot more takeaways from that for people in the content business like us. It definitely makes the content wheel spin a little bit faster. So yeah, a lot of great stuff. And SaturdayDownSouth.com, as I always tell people, the best one-stop shop for any college sports fan that'll keep you plugged in, whether you want to skip a little bit of time at work and just spend an afternoon catching up on your favorite team or catching up on, team that your team's playing in a few weeks, whatever, we got you covered.
There you go. Do it today at SaturdayDownSouth.com and subscribe to the podcast. It's very good, and I love listening to it each and every week. Connor, thank you so much, and we'll have to do this again soon.
Absolutely.